Jesus was journeying towards Jerusalem, and on the way he took the 12 aside and said to them, "We are now going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be given up to the chief priests. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the foreign power to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day he will be raised to life again."
Easter week in Jerusalem. Truly did the church call it the Great and Holy Week. For there was never another week like that in the history of the world. It was a week that changed mankind. For more than 1,800 million Christians, it was a week that fixed forever the way they understood themselves, the way they understood the world, and the way they understood the act of salvation. And it happened here, in Jerusalem, nearly 2,000 years ago. To the great city came tens of thousands of Jews, pilgrims to the temple, commanded by the Bible to be there 3 times a year in honor of the great festivals.
"3 times a year you shall keep a pilgrim feast to me. You shall celebrate the pilgrim feast of unleavened bread for 7 days."
The Feast of Spring is Passover, and among the Passover pilgrims that year was Jesus of Nazareth. The rabbi from Galilee began his last week on earth just outside Jerusalem, in a village on the Mount of Olives called Bethany. On the first Sunday morning after the arrival, Jesus and his disciples left Bethany to go to Jerusalem.
They reached Bethpage at the top of the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent 2 disciples with these instructions: "Go to the village opposite, where you will at once find a donkey tethered with her foal beside her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone speaks to you, say, 'Our master needs them,' and he will let you take them at once."
The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed, and brought the donkey and her foal, and they climbed the Mount of Olives. The Palm Sunday procession in Jerusalem follows that route and passes the site where Jesus stopped and wept over Jerusalem.
When he came in sight of the city, he wept over it and said, "For a time will come upon you when your enemies will set up siege works against you and hem you in at every point. They will bring you to the ground and not leave you one stone standing on another."
The church at this place is shaped like a teardrop and is called Dominus Flevit, the Lord wept. The crowd moves down the slopes of the Mount of Olives towards the city. It is now, as it was then, a joyful, colorful procession, and people from every corner of the world take part in it.
Crowds of people carpeted the road with their cloaks, and some cut branches from the trees to spread in his path. Then the crowd that went ahead and others that came behind raised the shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessings on him who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the heavens!"
Today, the pilgrims do not cut branches off the trees in Jerusalem. In an ancient and beautiful ceremony, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem blesses and distributes palm branches and olive branches to the community of the faithful.
When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city went wild with excitement. "Who is this?" people asked, and the crowd replied, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in the Galilee."
Nobody today would have to ask such a question, who is this man? But in Jerusalem, in the year 30 AD, the prophet from the Galilee was known only by some of the people. To others, especially the rulers of the city, his appearance was unwelcome. Rome ruled the city and the province through a military governor, the procurator Pontius Pilate, leaving the Jews free only in their temple worship. But even that wasn't really free, for the high priest was a Roman appointee. It was an explosive situation. Both procurator and priest had good reason to fear revolutionary prophets, especially on Passover, the festival of freedom from slavery. When Jesus came to Jerusalem, he went straight to the temple. The platform on which the temple stood is still there in the heart of the old city. The main entrance to the temple was then, unlike today, from the south. The old gate is still there, buried behind the city walls. The courtyard before the gates and the steps leading up to the temple were beautifully decorated with marble columns. When Jesus came here and went onto the Temple Mount, his presence was felt immediately. He chased the money changers from here, and all through the week, he and his disciples taught and preached and healed the sick.
Now the festival of unleavened bread, known as Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the doctors of the law were trying to devise some means of doing away with him, for they were afraid of the people.
Thursday was the eve of Passover. From the days of the Exodus from Egypt to our very own time, and of course during the great and holy week whose story we are telling, Jews everywhere prepare a place and a table for the holiday feast.
Now on the first day of unleavened bread, he sent out 2 of his disciples with these instructions. "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a jar of water. Follow him, and when he enters a house, give this message to the householder. The master says, 'Where is the room reserved for me to eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, set out in readiness. Make the preparations for us there."
The upper room was always identified with a site here on Mount Zion. It is just outside of today's city walls of Jerusalem, but in the year 30 AD, this place was inside the city. On Thursday evening, Jesus and the disciples, like Jews everywhere, sat down for Passover Seder. But then an extraordinary thing happened. In a gesture that startled his followers and captured forever the imagination of future generations,
Jesus rose from the table, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, tied it round him. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel. When it was Simon Peter's turn, Peter said to him, "You, Lord, washing my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not understand now what I am doing, but one day you will."
On Maundy Thursday, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, patriarchs of the 3 great communities of Christendom, the Latin, the Greek, and the Armenian, repeat the ceremony. They too are washing the feet of their disciples. After washing their feet and taking his garments again,
He sat down. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked. "If I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have set you an example."
In that room on that night, the Passover was not a joyous occasion. Jesus knew that his end was near. He could not long avoid the wrath of the local authorities, nor that of the Romans, for whom he was a revolutionary.
During supper, he took bread and broke it and gave it to them with the words, "Take this. This is my body." Then he took a cup and he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said, "This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, shed for many."
He knew, and he said, that one of his disciples would betray him, and that even Simon Peter, whose feet he had just washed, would deny him before the night was out. In deepening despair, the party finished the Passover meal and left the room on Mount Zion for the Mount of Olives. The Basilica of the Agony sits at the foot of the Mount of Olives, in the garden called Gethsemane, the olive press. Some of the trees are still here, and some of these trees are close to 2,000 years old.
When they reached a place called Gethsemane, he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray. My heart is ready to break with grief." Then he went forward a little, threw himself on the ground, and prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass him by. "Abba, Father," he said, "all things are possible to thee. Take this cup away from me. Yet not what I will, but what thou wilt."
It was too late. The wheels of the final act in this great and holy drama were already set in motion. Judas Iscariot appeared with a contingent of the local militia. The sign of betrayal was a kiss. After a short scuffle, which Jesus immediately stopped, they arrested him and brought him to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. Here they held Jesus overnight, and here in prison they questioned him. Some of his guards beat and spat on him. A church stands over the dungeon now, but in the courtyard, an ancient path and its steps are still there. This was the way from the Kidron Valley up to Mount Zion in those days. And it is clear that along this way, Jesus too was brought to trial before Caiaphas.
Again the high priest questioned him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "Need we call further witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy."
All that night, Jesus was held in prison. A few of his followers stayed outside, waiting to see what would become of their teacher.
Meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard when a serving maid accosted him and said, "You were there too with Jesus the Galilean." Peter denied it in the face of them all. "I do not know what you mean," he said.
Twice more, here on Mount Zion, Peter denied that he knew Jesus. And at the third denial, the cock crowed.
And Peter remembered how Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times." He went outside and wept bitterly.
They took the prisoner from Mount Zion to the fortress of the city. Caiaphas and the local authorities were either unable or unwilling to pass judgment on Jesus of Nazareth. This was a task for the Roman governor, the procurator, Pontius Pilate. It was Friday morning. In time, they came to call this Good Friday. The scene of the story, in the focus of the pilgrimage, has moved to King Herod's fortress in the corner of the Temple Mount.
As soon as morning came, the chief priests, having made their plan with the elders and lawyers in full council, put Jesus in chains. Then they led him away and handed him over to Pilate.
The trial took place in what the Gospels call the Praetorium. Pilgrim tradition has fixed that place as the fortress of Antonia. Its foundations are still here in the city of Jerusalem, and perhaps its floor. The stone pavement, Lithostrosos in Greek, is very old and may even be the original pavement of the Antonia fortress.
Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He replied, "The words are yours." Pilate questioned him again. "Have you nothing to say in your defense? You see how many charges they are bringing against you." But to Pilate's astonishment, Jesus made no further reply.
Pilate, in any case, condemned Jesus to death by crucifixion and turned him over to the soldiers for sport. There are games cut in the old stone floor, one of which is called Basilius, the game of the king, and involved the mocking of condemned prisoner. The Gospel describes it.
Pilate now took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, and robed him in a purple cloak. Then, time after time, they came up to him crying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him on the face. And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple cloak. "Ecce homo, behold the man," said Pilate.
Pilate's role in the drama was over. He washed his hands of the whole affair. The arch above is still called Ecce homo, behold the man. And it is from here that Pilate sent him off to be crucified. Generations of pilgrims have walked the Via Dolorosa, the traditional way of the cross, going in the footsteps of Jesus as he was led to Golgotha, the place of the skull, to be crucified. Not so long ago, city engineers found an important remnant from that period along the Via Dolorosa. Here, near the third station, nearly 12 feet below the surface, they discovered a street from the time of Jesus. The original stones were lifted up and incorporated into today's pavement. On Good Friday, the streets of Jerusalem are filled with tens of thousands of pilgrims from every corner of the world. They have come to walk the Via Dolorosa, to relive the events of that Holy Week.
Great numbers of people followed, many women among them, who mourned and lamented over him. Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. No, weep for yourselves and your children."
There are, traditionally, 14 stations of the cross. At the 6th station, pilgrims remember an old Jerusalem story of a woman who stepped from the crowd as Jesus was passing by and wiped his face. And an image of his face stayed on her kerchief. They called the woman Veronica, Vera Icon, true image. The Way of Sorrows ends at the place of the skull, Calvaria in Latin, Golgotha in Aramaic. Calvary has always been known to be here, inside what later became the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was an old stone quarry outside of town in the year 30 AD. A city wall passed 200 yards behind it. But different walls have been built since then, and the place is now right in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem. Here, inside the great church, the holy drama comes to its climax.
And when they reached the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, and the criminals with him, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." From midday, a darkness fell over the whole land, which lasted until 3 in the afternoon. And about 3, Jesus cried aloud, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Jesus again gave a loud cry and breathed his last.
For the followers of Jesus, all seemed lost. There remained but one last task, to take down the body and, at least, give it a decent burial.
When evening fell, there came a man of Arimathea, Joseph by name. He approached Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave orders that he should have it. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen sheet, and laid it in his own unused tomb, which he had cut out of the rock. He then rolled a large stone against the entrance and went away.
The stone of unction, just inside the main doors of the church, marks the traditional place where they cleaned and prepared Jesus' body for burial. In those days, Jews buried their dead in caves. They cut niches and shelves in the walls of the caves and sealed the entrance with a great rolling stone. There are hundreds of such cave tombs around the city of Jerusalem. 2 of them are connected to our story. The Garden Tomb, just north of the city, is a very good example of what Joseph's tomb may have looked like. Many Protestant groups believe this place to be a possible location for the tomb of Jesus himself. It certainly looks like what the original tomb must have looked like. At Easter, the garden is filled with a song of Protestant worship. And inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is an ancient cave tomb, which tradition says is the sepulchre of Joseph himself. Jesus' tomb, now covered and decorated by a small building in the center of the rotunda of the church, was once also a simple cave. After burying Jesus there, Joseph of Arimathea went home. It could be the end of the story. But nevertheless, a few women stayed and waited.
The women who had accompanied him from Galilee followed. They took note of the tomb and observed how his body was laid. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. And on the Sabbath, they rested in obedience to the commandment.
Saturday was a day of waiting. The church door is locked. Thousands of people gather outside. For 800 years, ever since Saladin expelled the Crusaders, a Jerusalem Muslim family has held the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. With great ceremony, they now open the doors for the worship of the Christians. For centuries, the Church looked for a way to symbolize the explosive miracle which was about to happen. On Holy Saturday, for the only time all year, the tomb itself is sealed, as Jesus' tomb was sealed and guarded. In time, the Church found a way to symbolize the miracle which was about to happen. By mid-afternoon, the church fills with great milling crowds of the faithful. The Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, with bishops from the Armenian and Syrian Orthodox communities tending him, enters the deserted tomb. Suddenly, the holy fire comes down out of the tomb and kindles the lamps. The symbolism is magnificent, for fire is the symbol of the resurrection. the crowd goes delirious with the joy of the resurrection. This flame passes from torch to torch throughout the church, throughout the city, and is borne in holy vessels to the farthest corners of the world.
And very early on Sunday morning, just after sunrise, they went into the tomb. They saw the stone, huge as it was, had been rolled back already. They went into the tomb, where they saw a youth wearing a white robe, and they were dumbfounded. But he said to them, "Fear nothing. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised again. He is not here."
It is Easter Sunday in Jerusalem. Christians of every denomination and community, every nation, race and color, are in their churches. There are Greeks and Latins, Armenians, Copts, Ethiopians, Chaldeans, Assyrians and Maronites.
So the disciples went home again.
Meanwhile, on the hills around the city, the different Protestant denominations are holding their services. Many are here on the Mount of Olives. Here our story began, and here it will end 50 days from today at Pentecost, when Jesus departed from his disciples and ascended from here to heaven. Yet the Christian world is united in the belief that even this is not the end of the story. The golden gate of the city of Jerusalem, the gate which leads from the Mount of Olives to the temple platform, the gate closed and sealed for 1,500 years, will one day reopen wide. For Jesus will return to Jerusalem, and history will have come to an end.